Welcome back to another quiet journey through the shadows of our world's stranger histories. It's told slowly and softly, designed to help you unwind, drift off, or simply relax as the night carries on. Tonight's story comes from a remote forest in Arizona, and from the mind of a man whose encounter with the unknown has lingered for decades in whispered conversations, late-night documentaries, and dusty shelves of UFO folklore. But before we step into that forest, to that moment in 1975 that changed everything for Travis Walton, take a second to get comfortable. Settle into your bed, or your chair, or wherever you might be listening from. Let your shoulders drop, unclench your jaw, and allow the rhythm of the words to lull you deeper into stillness. And now, before we begin, I wonder, what time is it where you are? Is it early in the evening or far past midnight? Are you hoping to fall asleep, or just letting your thoughts drift through the quiet? Whatever brought you here, you're in the right place. We won't be chasing thrills or rushing through events. Instead, we'll move slowly, gently, through time and mystery. So now, with the deep breath and the faint glow of stars in your imagination, let's step softly into the pine-covered hills of Snowflake, Arizona. The year is 1975. Imagine the faint hum of crickets giving way to silence as the early morning settles over the pine forests of eastern Arizona, where the town of Snowflake sleeps under a sky still scattered with the last traces of stars. The kind of sky that turns a soft lavender just before sunrise, as if the world is stretching quietly before the day begins. It is November, and the air is cold enough to fog the breath of anyone who steps outside at this hour, boots crunching against frost-dusted grass, jackets pulled tight, hands in gloves already worn from the season's work. Travis Walton, just 22 years old, wakes to this quiet world, the same as he had for weeks, alongside 6 other men who made their living in the forests surrounding their town, where the trees stood like towering sentinels, ancient and indifferent, watching over decades of logging work without protest or warning. There is a rhythm to their mornings, a repetition that brings with it a strange sense of comfort. A thermos of black coffee poured into a dented metal cup, a sandwich packed without thought, the weight of thick socks pulled over calloused feet, and then the gathering outside, always before first light, round a green and brown pickup truck that's seen better days, its engine grumbling, awake like it too is reluctant to start another day. They say very little as they drive, the forest gradually rising around them, trees crowding close to the winding road, shadows stretched long and sharp across the gravel as the sky begins to brighten slowly, turning the forest from silhouette to texture, branches, needles, bark all gaining color and depth in the morning light. Each man in the truck has his place, not assigned, but known, and the vehicle rocks with a familiar pattern of bodies shifting, old suspension creaking, one window cracked for air, smell of gasoline mixing with pine sap, and the faint trace of yesterday's sweat soaked into flannel. When they arrive at the job site, there is no announcement, no formality, just the sound of the truck door creaking open, boots hitting dirt, tools being lifted from the bed with a kind of efficiency that comes only from repetition. The forest accepts them without greeting or rejection, its silence thick, interrupted only by the mechanical whine of chainsaws and the rhythmic crash of falling timber, each impact sending a small tremor through the soil, birds startled into short flights before resettling. The work is hard and often monotonous, but it demands attention, clearing brush, sawing through tree trunks, dragging heavy limbs across uneven ground, securing logs for transport, all while navigating terrain that changes constantly beneath their feet. Rocks loosening, roots hidden, patches of frost clinging to shaded soil. They speak sparingly, often in shorthand, a look or gesture replacing a sentence, the kind of communication born from long hours side by side, where the value is placed on efficiency more than expression. Travis, younger than most of the others, moves with energy, sometimes climbing onto logs to adjust a strap, other times wiping sweat from his brow with a sleeve, his red hair catching bits of light between the trees. His hands strong from the work, calloused from long days of gripping axes and saw handles. Breaks are quiet, taken in the shade or perched on a fallen log, thermoses uncapped, sandwiches unwrapped, the silence broken only by the occasional laugh or a softly muttered complaint about a sore shoulder or the dull ache in knees that never seems to fully fade. They eat quickly, not because of urgency, but because there's little else to do, and the forest doesn't invite lingering. It watches without reaction, shadows shifting with the slow arc of the sun by afternoon. The tools begin to dull, and the men's movements slow slightly, the cumulative weight of labor sinking into their joints, into their backs, into the quiet between sentences. The sky begins to shift again, colors deepening into gold and amber. Tree trunks casting longer and darker shadows, the air cooling, jackets pulled tighter. The truck's doors opening once more for the slow ride home. The tires crunch over gravel and fallen needles, headlights flicking on as dusk begins to overtake the landscape, illuminating only what lies immediately ahead, while behind them the forest folds itself back into silence. Inside the truck, the men sit quietly, some resting eyes, others gazing out the windows as trees blur past, each of them thinking of home, of dinner, of hot water and worn-out mattresses. Their bodies sore, but accustomed to this fatigue, this repetition. There is nothing unusual about this day, nothing in the rhythm of the trees or the shape of the sky that would signal change. Only the familiar stillness of a place that has always been what it is, ancient, deep, and unmoved by the presence of men. But then, just as the last light fades from the horizon and the forest prepares to settle into night, something different emerges ahead on the road. It appears not as a shape, but as a glow, soft at first, then growing more defined, casting an amber hue through the trees, far too steady to be headlights, too large and too silent to be a lantern, hovering slightly above the ground, almost shimmering in the still air. The men shift in their seats, their silence now laced with confusion, a kind of collective unease that needs no explanation. And Travis, always quick to act, opens the door before anyone can stop him. Stepping out into the darkened clearing with his breath misting in the cool air and his boots softly sinking into the forest floor, the others call out quietly, not shouting, more like pleading, but he is already walking toward the light, his figure shrinking against the brightness, his silhouette absorbed by something none of them can define. And in that moment, as branches creak in the windless air and the forest seems to watch more closely than ever, the rhythm of their lives is broken, not with sound or violence, but with a silence so complete it drowns out even the hum of the truck's idle engine. This was no longer just another logging day. This was something else entirely, something no one would ever truly explain. Something that began with trees and boots and lunch in wax paper, and ended with a disappearance. The engine of the truck purred faintly in the dark, its low mechanical hum a fragile tether to normalcy, as 6 men sat unmoving inside, their faces dimly lit by the dashboard's dull orange glow, eyes fixed on the strange light filtering through the trees just ahead. A light that shimmered without flickering and pulsed without sound, hanging there between the branches like a misplaced star that had drifted too close to the ground. The headlights cast long streaks through the mist, catching the dust and moisture suspended in the air, particles dancing in the illumination, floating in the stillness like they too had been frozen by what was unfolding. And just beyond that curtain of quiet, Travis Walton stood alone in the glow, his silhouette outlined by the unearthly radiance that draped around him with a softness that seemed at odds with the intensity of its source. He had stepped out of the truck without hesitation, not with recklessness, but with an odd calm, as though something within him had accepted the strangeness of the moment as if it were inevitable. His steps measured and curious, not panicked, not forced, but almost drawn forward by an invisible current that seemed to pass from the light into him. The way gravity quietly calls to water falling from a leaf, the craft, if it could even be called that, hovered several feet above the ground, motionless, perfectly still, without the slightest downward rush of air or sound of propulsion. And though it bore no markings or seams, it shimmered faintly, its surface neither metal nor glass, but something smooth and impossibly seamless, as though shaped from thought rather than forged by machines. Travis paused beneath it, tilting his head back slightly to take it in, and the light wrapped around him in a way that was almost gentle, brushing over his shoulders, catching the red of his hair, illuminating the worn flannel shirt that rose and fell with each slow breath. Then, suddenly, there was a burst of brilliance, not sharp, not explosive, but instantaneous and full, filling the clearing with a whiteness so complete that for a moment the outlines of trees, of the truck, even of the watching men, seemed to dissolve into the brightness, as if reality itself had briefly softened when their vision cleared. They saw him on the ground. He was lying motionless, limbs slightly splayed, as though pushed backward, but not thrown, as if something had reached into him and pulled his consciousness away, leaving behind only the shell of a man still faintly lit by the glow that now dimmed, receding into itself like a tide pulling slowly back toward the sea. Then, without sound or signal, the object began to ascend, not abruptly, but with a grace that defied gravity, rising vertically through the treetops without disturbing even the closest branches. And within seconds, it was simply gone, swallowed by the night sky, as if it had never been there at all, as though the forest had imagined it and now, having second thoughts, had erased it again. No wind followed, no heat, no rush of displaced air, only the profound, deafening silence of absence. The kind of silence that settles not just into the space between sounds, but into the chest, the gut, the hollows of thought. The 6 remaining men did not speak, not at first. They simply sat in the truck, staring out at the space where the light had been, at the space where Travis had been, at the trees that now looked no different than before, but felt forever changed, as if the forest was somehow watching them now, holding its breath. Eventually, they opened the doors, stepping out into the cool night, the ground soft beneath their boots, the scent of pine and cold earth heavy in the air, and they approached the place where he had fallen, flashlights cutting wide, uneven arcs through the undergrowth, beams crossing and overlapping as they moved quietly. Each one half hoping to find him and half afraid of what they might see. But there was nothing. No broken branches, no indentation in the ground, no blood, no torn fabric, scorched earth, only the empty space where a man had been lying just moments before, in the lingering sense that the forest had closed around that space too quickly, too cleanly, as if trying to forget. They called his name, first gently, then louder, voices rising and falling into the darkness. The sound carried by trees that gave no reply. They spread out slightly, circling the clearing, checking behind bushes, behind logs, behind any shape that might conceal a body. But it was as if Travis had never been there at all, as if he had been plucked from time, from space, removed with such precision that the world had not even rippled in response. Eventually, they regrouped near the truck, flashlights lowered, faces pale and unsure, and, for a long moment, they stood in a loose, silent circle. Each man watching the others as though seeking validation for what he had seen, needing someone else to say aloud what none of them could quite yet bring themselves to believe. They got back in the truck. The drive back into town was slow, deliberate, the road winding before them in the headlights like a path they were no longer certain lead anywhere familiar. And though the truck's tires crunched gravel and the engine made its usual low complaints, the men said nothing. It wasn't fear, not exactly. It was something quieter, deeper. It's like standing on the edge of understanding and realizing how far the drop truly is. By the time they reached Snowflake, it was late. The lights of the sheriff's office cast long rectangles onto the sidewalk as they walked inside together, still in their work clothes, still carrying the dust and sap of the day on their sleeves. And when they sat down to explain what had happened, the words came slowly, carefully, without urgency, spoken not like a story, not like a report, but like a confession, like something that had happened to them but was still happening, something they didn't want to believe but couldn't deny. They didn't ask to be believed, they only said what they saw, and the room grew quiet once more, as quiet as the clearing where Travis Walton had stood beneath a floating light and vanished without a sound. There was no pain, no sound, not even the sensation of movement, only a curious blankness, soft and quiet and indistinct, as though consciousness itself had been gently folded away and set aside. And when Travis Walton began to stir again, it was not in the dramatic jolt of panic, but in the slow, uncertain way one might drift up from a deep dream, only partially aware of the line between memory and imagination, between body and mind. He opened his eyes, or rather, became aware that they were open to a ceiling that wasn't a ceiling at all, but a smooth, luminous surface glowing evenly with a white light that held no visible source, a light that filled the room entirely but cast no shadows, no harsh reflections, as though it were a natural presence rather than an artificial one, as soft and complete as sunlight seen through layers of mist. The surface beneath him was firm but not cold, yielding slightly beneath the shape of his body in a way that felt deliberate, as though it had been made to cradle rather than confine, and his limbs, though present, responded slowly as though submerged in warm water, dulled by distance, or perhaps by something he could not feel. His chest rose and fell in steady rhythm, but he was not breathing hard, not gasping or frightened, only aware, distantly, that he was somewhere that made no sense. He did not remember leaving the forest, did not recall the flash of light or the way the craft had risen through the pines. And so, for a moment, a very brief moment, he thought, or hoped, that he might be in a hospital, that perhaps he had simply collapsed or been injured, and that these sensations, this strange room, this strange light, were all part of a recovery process he did not yet understand. But then, silence pressed in, not the kind of silence found in hospitals, which is always laced with subtle signs of life. Distant footsteps, or a beeping monitor, or the gentle squeak of wheels on tile, but a deeper, heavier quiet, the kind that absorbs sound rather than holds it, the kind that feels constructed, intentional, and when he turned his head, or perhaps only imagined turning it, he saw them three beings, small and slight, with skin that appeared smooth and featureless, as though made of clay or wax or light itself, stood beside him, their heads slightly larger in proportion than seemed natural, their eyes wide and dark and unblinking, their bodies unmoving, not with stiffness, but with a kind of patient attentiveness, as though they were observing something fragile, waiting for something to happen. They did not speak, did not gesture, and made no effort to restrain him. And yet he could not rise. Not fully. He could only move slowly, sluggishly, as though caught in the gravity of a dream, or held back by some unseen field. Not painful, not insistent. His instinct was not terror, not yet, but confusion, a quiet, blooming unease that crept in slowly, carried not by what was happening, but by what was absent. No voices, no words, no identifiable tools, no windows, no signs of time passing, only smooth curves and a soft hum that might not have even been real at some point. They moved away from him, though he could not remember when, and new figures appeared, taller, more human in appearance, their features less alien, but no more familiar, their expressions calm, composed, and unreadable, their movements fluid, almost rehearsed. They wore garments that were uniform but not elaborate, a muted color, a subtle texture, no visible fastenings. And when one of them reached out a hand, palm open and fingers extended, it did not feel threatening, but neither did it feel like kindness. He followed them, though he does not remember walking, only moving, somehow, from one space into another, from one softly lit room to a space that opened wider, perhaps a hallway, perhaps something else entirely, where the walls were curved and seamless, and the air smelled of nothing at all in this new space. He was shown something, or brought to something, a surface that shimmered, perhaps a screen, perhaps a window, perhaps nothing that we would understand as either, where lights moved in patterns, too slow to be chaotic, but too complex to be random, and stars drifted like lanterns set afloat in an invisible current, distant and unknowable and beautiful in a way that did not comfort him, but also did not frighten him, only lulled him into a deeper sense of disconnection from whatever life he had come from. There were no clocks, no mirrors, no food or water or any of the things one might expect from a place built to house a human being. And yet he did not feel thirst, did not feel hunger, only a growing sense that time was no longer unfolding in a way he could comprehend, that perhaps it had stopped altogether, or that he had stepped outside of it. He remembered, at times, being alone, floating, drifting, lying still, and at other times being watched, not constantly, not invasively, but with the steady attention of beings who saw him not as a guest, not as a captive, but as a subject of interest, a piece of some larger puzzle that they were content to observe rather than solve. And though he never recalled speech, or sound, or language of any kind, he came to understand, or perhaps only imagined, that their interest was not hostile, not cruel, not even particularly emotional, simply neutral, like the way we watch fish swim in a tank, or the way a scientist watches a flame react to air. Whether hours passed, or days, or mere minutes, he could not say, for the passage of time had no markers in that place, only the gentle rhythm of breath and the quiet awareness of being inside something he could not begin to describe. And then, one moment, suddenly, without transition, it ended. He awoke, lying on the cold ground beside a stretch of highway near Heber, Arizona, the early morning air biting at his skin, the stars overhead, brilliant and uncaring, the scent of pine needles and distant wood smoke reminding him that he was home, or at least close to it. His body was intact, his clothes were the same, and though his memory was hazy, fragmented, blurred around the edges, the sense of what had happened, or what he believed had happened, clung to him like mist that would not lift. He stumbled to his feet, his legs unsteady, his voice cracking with disuse, and somehow with no clear understanding of how long he had been gone. He made his way to a nearby gas station, called for help, and was taken to safety, or what passes for safety when the world no longer fits the shape it once held. He had been gone for 5 days, and in all that time, not a single soul had known where he was. Only Travis could tell the story, and even he wasn't sure if it was memory or dream. The town of Snowflake was not large, and it was not known for trouble, and when the men stepped back into it, with dust still clinging to their clothes and silence hanging between them, the air seemed to shift, slightly, like something fragile had been disturbed, something normally buried beneath years of routine and repetition and safety. Stood with the door to the sheriff's office and began to speak. It was not in panic or in anger, but in the low, careful voices of people who had seen something they could not name and who now found themselves unsure whether to whisper it away or say it out loud again and again until it stopped sounding real. They sat quietly while the story was taken down point by point, and the officers listened with that careful stillness that people wear when they are trying not to react too quickly, and though they asked questions and raised brows and exchanged glances, none of them laughed, because there was nothing about the men in that room that seemed like they were playing a trick or telling a tale for attention. Their hands were steady but tense, their eyes focused but tired, and when one of them repeated that Travis had been struck by a beam of light and lifted off the ground and then vanished, they said it as if they were still trying to believe it themselves. Before the sun had fully risen, the next morning, the search had already begun, men moving in quiet lines across the forest floor, walking into the thick pine underbrush where the smell of sap and moss rose up with every footstep, and birds rustled in the branches but never sang, and they called his name in calm, deliberate tones like they were trying not to wake. Something as they swept through trees that all looked the same, but somehow felt different now, darker, somehow quieter, as if the woods too were holding their breath. Helicopters came eventually, their blades chopping softly through the air and sending ripples through the treetops, while men in harnesses scanned the forest below for broken limbs or flattened grass or scraps of clothing. But there was no sign of disturbance, not a single torn thread or footprint. No drag marks, no scuffed bark, and no sign that anyone had lain down in the place. The loggers had described only dry needles and quiet earth, undisturbed and still. By the second day, more volunteers had joined, some from the town, some from other counties, drawn by curiosity or duty or something stranger, and they too combed the woods, side by side with maps and radios and flashlights even during the daylight. And they marked off grids and cleared areas and documented every step, and still the forest offered nothing. And by the time night fell again, people had begun to speak more openly, their voices low, their questions careful but insistent, because no one simply vanished without a trace. Not here, not in Snowflake, not like this. Back in town, people whispered quietly in grocery aisles and parking lots, leaning across fences and counters, wondering if perhaps there had been an argument that night, or a fall, or a mistake, or something darker, something the men weren't saying. And as each hour passed, the idea of alien craft and beams of light began to stretch thinner in the minds of those who were not there, who had not seen the light in the clearing, and who found it easier to believe in something human, even if it was ugly or strange, than to accept something not of this world. The lockers were questioned again and again, not with force, but with persistence, and each time their stories held the same shape, same moments, repeated the same details, offered not word for word, but with the rhythm of memory, not invention, and polygraphs were administered quietly, behind closed doors, and though they did not answer every question, and though no machine can truly measure truth, the results suggested they were not lying, and this only made things stranger, not simpler, because it removed the easy explanation and left behind only the harder possibility that maybe what they had said was exactly what had happened. Reporters began to arrive, first one, then two, then a van from Phoenix, and then more, and with them came cameras and microphones and questions that were louder and faster and more eager than anything the town was used to. And the men who had worked together in silence and sweat now found themselves standing on sidewalks under boom mix and being asked to speak again and again about things they themselves had not yet managed to understand. Some believed them, immediately drawn by a sense of wonder or a quiet recognition of honesty in their eyes. Others remained skeptical and spoke of mass hysteria or tricks or the human mind's ability to create false memories under stress, and some simply watched from porches and living rooms, unsure what to think, letting the story wash over them, while the days continued to pass and the forest remained as still and inscrutable as ever. The third day passed, and so did the fourth, and still there was no Travis, no body, no note, no voice on the wind, only the mounting pressure of not knowing and the soft beginning of doubt in the hearts of those who had wanted to believe at first, but who now found themselves reaching for something firmer to hold on to. And by the fifth day, the search teams had grown smaller, the helicopters had left, the media had begun to look toward other towns, and other stories in Snowflake began to exhale again, but not with relief, only with fatigue. And then he returned, stumbling along the roadside, dazed and gaunt and barefoot in the morning chill, and though he did not look injured, and though he could walk and speak and blink in the sunlight, something in his face had changed. Something about his voice was softer, slower, and when he said he did not know exactly where he had been, only that he remembered a strange ceiling and faces that did not belong to any person he had ever seen. The people who heard him fell into a hush that felt different from the ones before. Not the hush of confusion, not the hush of disbelief, but the hush of quiet awe. When Travis Walton reappeared, on that quiet stretch of highway under the wide and endless Arizona sky. He was not the same man who had vanished 5 days earlier into the cold, whispering pines, and though he bore no wounds and carried no signs of physical harm, there was something different in the way he moved, in the way his eyes settled on faces, as though searching for some anchor in the familiarity of the world around him. Something had shifted deep within him, and though he could not name it, that difference would remain with him for the rest of his life. He did not rush into town or call out or make declarations. He found his way slowly, carefully, as if uncertain whether the place he had returned to would still receive him. And when he finally reached help, the words came only in fragments, a kind of quiet unraveling that carried more weight in its pauses than in its content. And when he was taken in by family and friends, the reunion was not filled with celebration or excitement, but with an almost sacred silence. It's a kind of hush that only follows something too large to explain and too strange to fully hold. Doctors ran tests, checked vitals, examined his skin and his eyes and his responses, and though there were small signs of stress and disorientation, there was nothing that could account for his absence, nothing that explained where he had been or what he had endured. And though some noted his mild dehydration and apparent sleep deprivation, these were not the hallmarks of a man lost in the woods or hiding in fear. They were the subtle echoes of time passed under circumstances that could not be named. And when the questioning began again, both by police and press and ordinary people alike, Travis offered what he could with a steady and deliberate voice, never insisting and never embellishing, only describing in soft, broken detail what he had experienced. And though many wanted more details, more clarity, more evidence, he simply gave what he remembered and let it stand, as it was not polished or rehearsed, but fragmented like glass underwater, shimmering with meaning that could not quite be touched. He spoke of a space that did not feel like a room, and of lights that came from nowhere and cast no shadow, and of figures, who watched him with wide eyes that never blinked and moved with purpose, but without emotion. And he did not say they were monsters or saviors. He did not call them demons or angels. He simply said they were there, and that he had been watched and measured and moved and observed, and that at no point had he felt pain, but at every point he had felt the overwhelming certainty that he was not meant to understand what was happening. Polygraph tests were taken in time, not one, but several spaced across different moments with different experts, and though one came back unclear, the rest pointed in the same direction and said simply that he was not lying. And this result, more than any testimony, carried the quiet power of unresolved truth, because it left room for belief without certainty, and for skepticism without dismissal. And for once, both sides found themselves not arguing over facts, but quietly wondering about meaning. His fellow workers also took the tests, and their stories matched in rhythm and tone, in sequence, and in emotion, not perfect, but natural, consistent in the way that lived memory often is. And the town watched as these men, who had once been seen as simple loggers, were now placed on television screens and newspaper pages and conference stages, asked to defend not just what they saw, but what they had become unwilling symbols of something larger than themselves. Travis returned to his life slowly and carefully, not hiding, but not seeking attention, and in time he wrote down his memories and published them not as a spectacle, but as a kind of record, a map of one man's journey into something unnamed, and the book found readers, not because it shouted or begged to be believed, but because it offered a window into something quietly haunting, a recollection presented with humility and restraint. And in doing so, it invited not agreement, but reflection. Eventually, Hollywood came calling, as it always does, and the story was transformed into something louder and brighter. It's filled with drama and special effects, and fear and aversion of the event bore only partial resemblance to the one Travis had shared. And though he did not protest loudly, he did note that it was not his memory, not his experience, not truly, and he let the film live on its own terms, while he continued to speak only of what he knew to be true for himself. And still the story grew, not like wildfire, but like ivy slowly winding its way through the culture, through midnight radio shows and dusty paperbacks and whispered conversations between strangers in the name. Travis Walton became something more than a name. It became a story, a question, a symbol of what it means to encounter something beyond explanation and return not with proof, but with silence. Through the years, letters came in from people who had seen things they could not explain, or felt things they could not prove, or dreamed things they were afraid to share in Travis. Read them all quietly and responded when he could, always with kindness, never with judgment, 'cause he understood what it meant to carry a story others refused to believe, and he understood too what it meant to carry it anyway. Skeptics remained and always will, and their voices too are part of the story, raising questions and offering theories and reminding the world that belief is not a substitute for evidence, but also that evidence does not always arrive on time. And in that space between doubt and faith, the story of Travis Walton continued to live, not because it could be proven, but because it could not be disproven either. And so it became a kind of folklore, not the ancient kind passed down through generations, but the modern kind carried by radio waves and pixelated screens and long night drives through the desert with headlights sweeping across the trees, where someone might look up and remember, that once a man disappeared into the forest and came back changed, and said only what he remembered, and asked no one to believe but everyone to listen, because in the end the power of his story is not in what it proves, but in what it allows. It allows us to wonder without demanding answers. It allows us to hold space for things we cannot yet explain, and it reminds us gently that sometimes the most important thing is not whether something truly happened, but whether it truly stayed with us long after the moment passed. And for those who lie awake at night, listening to the wind press against the windows and watching the slow blink of stars above, this quiet voice of Travis Walton still echoes, not as a warning, not as a lesson, but as a reminder that the world is still full of mystery, and sometimes those who step into it return not with answers, but with stories that feel like dreams. There are stories that stay with us not because they are loud or conclusive, but because they are soft and open-ended, because they do not demand belief or disbelief, but simply invite attention, a gentle kind of attention, the kind you give to a breeze that brushes past your skin, or the way light shifts across the wall in the early hours of morning in the story of Travis. Walton is one of those stories, a story not of proof, but of presence, not of certainty, but of stillness, not of explanation, but of wonder. It is not a story that tries to prove something, not really, and it's not one that insists on being remembered for its details or its implications. Instead, it moves more like water around the edges of our thoughts, slowly filling the spaces. we didn't know were waiting to be filled, and to rest there, quietly, not asking to be solved, but simply to be heard, and perhaps return to once in a while like a dream you didn't understand, but can't quite forget. When he came back, Travis did not offer clarity or spectacle. He did not demand attention or belief, and he did not turn his experience into a performance. He returned the way a person wakes from something too big to name slowly, and with care, searching for language when none seemed to fit, and as the years passed, he did not alter his words, did not change the core of what he shared, even as others around him turned his story into books and movies and commentary and questions. He remained steady, speaking only of what he remembered, no more, no less. That is perhaps why the story has lasted for so long, not because it was dramatic, not because it promised answers, but because it left room for people to listen without needing to decide it. Offered not just a description of something strange, but a space in which strangeness could be acknowledged, accepted, even welcomed as a part of the human experience. And that is a rare thing in a world that so often asks for proof and conclusion and closure. In Travis's voice, there was never urgency, never the cadence of someone trying to convince or convert. And over time, his calm became part of the story itself. The way he spoke became a reflection of the experience, not marked by fear or excitement, but by a quiet awe, the kind that stays long after something has passed, the kind of awe that doesn't fade, but settles into the background like a low hum in the quiet of a room. And it's that quiet hum that so many people return to, not the event itself, but the space. It opens up a space where we can sit with our own questions and not feel pressured to answer them, where we can wonder about what else might exist just outside the reach of our understanding, not in a way that disturbs or unsettles, but in a way that soothes, in a way that reminds us how little we truly know and how comforting that can be, because sometimes the unknown is not a threat. Sometimes it is a blanket. Sometimes it is the vast sky overhead filled with stars we'll never touch and yet still feel drawn to. And Travis's story is like that sky full of patterns we can't fully see, full of lights we can't quite explain, and full of stories that will never be fully understood, but still matter deeply simply because they are part of what makes us human. And in the years since his return, the world has changed countless times. New technology, new discoveries, new mysteries, and yet this story continues to float just beneath the surface of our collective memory, not anchored to a moment, but drifting gently across decades. Like a feather on a still lake, it has become less about aliens or spacecraft or tests, and more about the way we hold stories, about the way we make room for what doesn't fit, about the way we learn to live with questions. Every so often, someone still finds themselves thinking about it, or mentioning it, or searching it up late at night, not necessarily to study it or solve it, but just to sit with it, to sit in its quiet orbit and feel that slight tug on the imagination, the soft sensation of mystery pulling them out of the ordinary, just far enough to see things differently. And maybe that's why you're here listening now, not because you're curious about what happened in the woods many years ago, because a part of you wants to drift toward that feeling. It's that subtle shift in perspective that comes from stepping just outside the edges of what's known and letting your mind stretch into the dark just a little. And that's the beauty of stories like this, the way they offer not just content but comfort, not just detail but distance, the kind of gentle distance that lets you feel far from the noise of every day. Life far from tasks and timelines and to-do lists, and closer to something older, something slower, something quieter. Because the story of Travis Walton is not just about what he saw or where he went. It is about what happens afterward, about how we sit with the unexplained, about how we carry the soft weight of not knowing, and how we return again and again to the same question. Not for an answer, but simply because the question is beautiful, because the question makes us feel like we are part of something vast. And so, as your mind begins to slow, as your body settles further into the softness beneath you, as your breath moves like wind through trees, you may find yourself not needing to think anymore, not needing to follow the thread of the story, but simply letting it wrap around you like a quiet fog, like a soft echo, like the night itself, stretching gently into sleep. You may find that the lights of the story begin to dim and blur, and that the shapes become softer, and the sounds more distant, and you may feel yourself floating slightly in that space, between wakefulness and rest, between fact and wonder, between what is remembered and what is dreamed. And that is exactly what this story was meant to bring you. And if you are still awake, if your thoughts are still wandering gently like stars that have not yet settled into their place in the sky, that is all right. You do not need to rush. There is no need to follow. There is only this moment, this quiet, this hush, this hum. And if sleep finds you slowly, then let it. If sleep finds you quickly, then welcome it. And if sleep has already found you, and you are no longer hearing these words, then may your dreams be peaceful and your night long and calm. And may the mystery stay with you, not as a weight, but as a lullaby. Because the story continues, not in headlines or arguments or debates, but in moments like this, in the stillness that comes after the telling and the breath that follows the last word in the hush that settles like dust across the stars. Sleep well, you're safe, you're home.